Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's book review time today. Let's take a look at Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. So Legends and Lattes is not the normal sort of fantasy that you would tend to see me reading. I like epic fantasy, I like big battles, big world building, big multi-POV casts, but Legends and Lattes is the sort of book that really goes to prove that you don't need to tick all of those boxes to get a nice big tick in the enjoyment box. So I got the opportunity to take a review copy of the traditionally published release of this book, and because I've seen so many people say that they loved this story, including a lot of my close friends in the community whose opinions I really trust, I jumped at the opportunity to take a look for myself and see what it was all about. The premise is pretty straightforward. We have an orc named Viv who is part of a band of adventurers. She retires and she sets up a coffee shop in a city where basically nobody has heard of coffee before. The story then is all about Viv getting this business off the ground and overcoming the various hurdles associated with that. To my mind, this book is the most famous of the kind of subgenre that's called cosy fantasy. And as is the way with fantasy, there is no real defined meaning of the term. For me, as someone who is far from an expert and has almost no experience in reading cosy fantasy, I think of it as meaning low tension, comfortable reading, and one of the key defining factors for me is it being a story about people just going about their everyday lives. There's no big adventures or dire threats to life or anything along those lines. Now, one of the things that I really liked about Legends and Lattes is I feel this is the sort of story that can take place in any epic fantasy world that you care to name. If you take away the specifics of race, of magic, of location, you're left with a story that could easily take place in Hobbs' Six Duchies, in Feist's Midkemia, in Sanderson's Cosmere. You get the picture. All of these worlds have towns and cities populated by people like you and me. They're not all warriors and mages, royals and farm boys who look a bit different to their parents and have a niggling feeling that they're part of something bigger. And I like that this is a story that focuses on those normal kind of everyday people. Yes, Viv is a former adventurer, but that's her past life, and here she's just a coffee shop owner looking to make a success of her business. Now, outside of the story, there are plenty of things that tell you that this is set in an epic fantasy world, the sort of world that those giant trilogies might take place in. There's a real depth of world building that subtly comes through between the lines. There's plenty of traditional fantasy races like orcs, gnomes, dwarves and elves, but then you also have hobs and ratkins and direcats and of course succubi. There are little hints of magic here as well, with a magical academy in the city, and you've got some magical artifacts and spells gently dusted through the pages as well. And none of the world building here felt the slightest bit out of place. It all somehow fit perfectly with the cosy story that was being told. I thought the characters were well put together, both in terms of the range of characters that we got, but also the way that they were individually well fleshed out. There are some convenient meetings, and it does make things a little bit too easy perhaps in some parts of the story, but actually that does get explained, and I like the way that that was done, and just the fact that it was done in the first place. The main characters complemented each other well, and where Viv left a team of adventurers, she formed a new team around herself in a very similar fashion. If Legends and Lattes is a cosy fantasy, then Viv and her new crew are the cosy equivalent to the typical band of fantasy adventurers. So where there's no real tension in this book, no high stakes so to speak, in order to appeal to a reader like me, the storytelling has to be of a really high standard, and that's exactly what I got here. The writing is so easily accessible that the pages just seem to fly by, and instead of the fast-paced freneticism of an epic fantasy story, this was more a leisurely stroll through the day-to-day lives of these characters, but the writing itself meant that the pacing was absolutely spot on. I thought overall it was a well-executed idea. Everything fit the story, and the story fit the world it was set in, even if it's not the normal sort of story that you would tend to get from such a world. Now, because I have this new edition, I have some extras as well. I've not seen an original copy of Legends and Lattes, so I don't know if any of this is included within that volume as well. But here we have at the end of the book, as well as the acknowledgements, an interview with the author, and also a recipe for Thimble's biscuits, or the Thimblets as they became known. The key addition that you have here though is a short story called Pages to Fill, which serves as a bit of a prologue to the actual main novel itself. This tells us more about Viv's time in her band of adventurers, and it gives us a bit more information about the type of person she is, if person is still an applicable term for an orc, but we also learn some more details about the early stages of her quest for the Skelvet Stone, and also where she first found coffee in the city of Azimuth. I quite enjoyed this short story. I think if it was placed at the beginning of the novel as an actual prologue, it would have seemed out of place because the tone is very different to what you get in Legends and Lattes itself, but featuring at the end of the story as an extra, it was a very welcome addition to my reading experience. So all of that leads to some ratings anyway, and although it didn't have many of the usual elements that I look for in a fantasy story, I still really enjoyed my time reading Legends and Lattes, so in the end I decided to give it a very nicely deserved 5 stars. In terms of my weighted ratings, that enjoyment that I found here translates to a score of 18 out of 20. I just really enjoyed my time reading it. The pages, as I say, flew by. I didn't feel bored of the book at any point, even though there was no real adventure, so to speak of. None of the usual quick-paced action that I tend to enjoy in my fantasy, so it was a really well-told story in that respect. The world building I actually really enjoyed. I loved those little elements that we got. Of course, because of the type of story being told, we don't get to see too much of it. Although I feel like it was a very good, a very well developed world, because we are focused on a very small portion of it, we don't get the opportunity to explore like we would normally have. I ended up giving this one 16 out of 20, although I do feel like I'm potentially underselling it a little bit because what I did see was very well done. The characters, I said, were really nicely put together and really well fleshed out. I gave this category 18 out of 20 because I like the way that everything meshed together in that respect. I feel like there was a good mix between the main characters and what I like to think of as the supporting characters, and I like as well that throughout both of those kind of categories you had a good mix of different races as well. For the plot, I went with 16 out of 20 because although what we do have is very well done, it's another of those categories that is almost hamstrung in terms of my personal ratings by the self-contained nature of the story itself. We don't see too much of a plot, but the plot that we do have is actually really nicely put together. For the writing style, I said in the main part of my review that this was one of the highlights of the book for me really. It was really well done, really well written. I had a great time reading it because of the accessibility of the writing, and I ended up giving this one 9 out of 10 as a result. And again, for the pacing, I said this was pretty much spot on, and that covers the whole book. It wasn't just really nicely paced with a few little issues here and there. I didn't really have an issue with pacing at any point, and as a result I've given this one 4 out of 5. And then for the discretionary, I've given 2 out of 5 because I do like the new cover that we've got here. I do potentially prefer the old cover, although I don't have any real attachment to it, but it's more maybe my type of cover than the current one that's sitting on my shelf. We do have within this book though, the end pages, a nice addition in colour of that original cover. And then you do have those extras that I spoke about as well at the end of the book. So 2 out of 5 for this one accounts for those extras. So altogether that gives a score of 83% for Legends and Lattes, which I feel was a really good score, especially for the sort of book that wouldn't normally take my fancy. It shows that all of the individual elements that go into my weighted ratings can lead to a really good score, even if it might be a surprising one. In terms of my Hall of Fame, that good score translates to a ranking of equal 23rd with, I say this quite a lot, but it's in some really good company in that part of the table. So there we go, that's Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, a self-published release that is now available as of today at the point of this video being released. It's now available as a traditionally published book as well. Let me know in the comments down below if you're one of the many people who's read this book. What did you think about it? And also, what did you think of my feelings about the book? While you're down there, do the usual liking and subscribing stuff. Check out my social media and support the channel, links below the video. I'll hopefully see you in the next one sometime soon. But until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.